Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's Common Ground. I'm Malva Kajali, Special Projects Associate here at the Rail, and today I'm thrilled to be welcoming you to the third installment of Publishing in Transit with our friends at New Directions Press. We're so happy to be welcoming VP and Senior Editor Declan Spring alongside two of his authors, Forrest, Gander and Thalia Field, both of whom have books freshly out with New Directions, which I'm sure we'll hear from and hear about shortly. And this wonderful and motley crew is joined by curator of this series, the fantastic Cole Swensen. Finally, we've started out all of our events here with two important acknowledgements. The first is that here in New York, we're located on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and the Shinnecock Indian Nation. The second is an acknowledgement that Black Lives Matter. And I think it's worth taking a moment to remind ourselves that both of these acknowledgements are a commitment to the liberation of the oppressed and solidarity for all those who struggle for freedom. In that spirit, I encourage you all to check out the chat for a living document of resources and actions I'll drop shortly. We've been putting these together behind the scenes. But now we'll get right into it. It's my honor to welcome our wonderful guests of this afternoon. First up is Vice President and Senior Editor Declan Spring. He's been working at New Directions since '91, and currently he edits about a third of their list. During his tenure, he's edited works by Paul Auster, Anne Carson, Jorge Baranbiza, Inger Christensen, and of course, Thalia Field, who is also here with us today. Like all women who have cultivated the art of personal mystique, Thalia has a past life in theater as a writer, director, and producer before making the transition into books. Her latest book, Personhood, came out just in May of this year with New Directions and follows Bird Lover's Backyard and Experimental Animals, a reality fiction, in exploring ecological narratives in our confused world. She is the Adele Kellenberg-Seaver Professor of Creative Writing at Brown and the current faculty director at the Brown Arts Institute. And she's joined both on this panel and really in a writerly focus on land and ecology by the writer and translator Forrest Gander. Forrest was born in the Mojave Desert and has wandered Northern California in a life and letters ever since. His books also often concern ecology and include Be With, which came out with New Directions, winner of the 2019 Pulitzer Prize, the novel Trace, and Twice Alive, which came out just recently. His translations and co-translations are numerous, and he's received grants from the Library of Congress, the Guggenheim, and more. And last but not least, they're joined by the curator of this fine series, poet Cole Swensen. She's the author of 17 volumes of poetry, one collection of critical essays, and a book of hybrid poem essays titled Art in Time, which came out with Nightboat just this summer, I believe. She's a former Guggenheim Fellow. She's been a finalist for the National Book Award, and she has received the Iowa Poetry Prize and the National Poetry Series Prize, among many others. She's translated over 20 volumes of poetry, prose, and art criticism from the French. And here she is to translate the secrets of publishing for us. So Cole, take it away.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you to everyone at the Brooklyn Rail and Malvika in particular, and Nick in particular, for all the work you're doing on this series. The program today will start with short readings by Thalia and Forrest, and then we'll segue into a conversation for about 40 minutes or so. And that will be mostly Thalia and Forrest getting a chance to ask Declan all the questions that they've always wanted to ask him, and give Declan a chance to let us all into kind of the backstage version of publishing. And then after that, we'll go into a Q&A. So again, put your questions in the chat, and Malvika will negotiate that, arrange that, juggle that, and make it all work. And then we'll end with Declan's reading whatever he'd like to read, it's up to him. Just a quick note, the next in the series is September 9 for Ugly Duckling Press with the editor Matvey Yankelevich and the authors Monica de la Torre and Rachel Levitsky. So that's again, September 9, 1 p.m. Eastern time. So we hope to see you again there. And again, thank you very much for coming. And now I just want to get everybody's voice into the room and hear from Declan and Thalia and Forrest. Maybe let's start with Declan and tell us where you are. Tell us what you're seeing out the window, what the weather's like.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. And I'm so excited to be here for this wonderful event. Thalia and Forrest and I have been working on books for, you could call it decades now. And real friendships have evolved out of these projects, working together all this time. So it's really fun to be here with them. And I love working at New Directions, and there's such incredible history around it. And I love talking about New Directions. So I'm really looking forward to this. And I think this is going to be a great half hour or so. Thanks everybody for coming. And I'm in Philadelphia right now where I live. I commute up to New York crazily, but I live in Philadelphia, and that's where I am now.
Talia, you want to tell us what you're seeing out the window?
Yeah, well, I'm here in the unfortunately warm and humid Northeast, Providence, Rhode Island, and the ragweed has literally just chosen this morning to burst open into flower, and I apologize in advance for all the sniffling. That's where I am.
Forrest?
Forrest. I'm in Petaluma, California. As you can see from my bookshelves behind me, I'm in the process of moving. The big shelf back there was just the New Directions titles that I've collected since I was in college. And my identity with my books gone seems to have diminished completely. I realize how much my books represent my own identity to myself.
Thank you all. Let's start by getting right into some writing. And we'll start with the.
It's going to be pretty helpful to Forrest right now. We can get his identity back. Get a stable footing first.
Yes.
Just in time. Great. So we'll start with hearing about 5 minutes from Thalia. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Cole, for inviting me to be part of this. And of course, thank you, Declan. And I'm happy to celebrate the labor of people who work behind the scenes in books, because I don't feel like people get enough attention. So I'm very glad to be able to contribute to that. So I'm going to read a little bit of sections from a piece from Personhood called Liberty Trees. Resistance. Scientists surround a yellow poplar in Annapolis, alive more than 400 years and last surviving of 13 original Liberty trees in pretty poor shape after a fatal blow in a hurricane. Someone mentions asexual propagation techniques, cuttings and grafts and tissue culture methods, or for whatever it's worth, clone living descendants, the headline reads, move over, Dolly, make way for the Liberty tree. Seedlings come from scions, the legacy matters, becomes the DNA of American history, all that we fought for, one argues. It must be the same DNA, but who is the we and what was we fought, another asserts. It's a different world. The forests have changed, the temperatures, whole species gone north or south. These trees have no resistance. These were trees for the liberty of white persons. Not so, men surround the scion. The clone transmits the best idea we ever had back to every state of the Union. Resistance. August 14th, 1765, the largest elm in Hanover Square gets possessed with effigies, dangling joyfully, they say, the branches proud with stuffed dolls. A small group shouts, look, the royal stamp agent Oliver dismembered and the devil beside him. Let's to the man's house. A tree to run? How can a tree run? See the real Oliver terrorized, his home hacked by boots and axes, his furniture torched for that one grasp of ore. Panting, hands on knees, he pleads guilty, but spare the children. A placard, bloodied, reads liberty, and not a capillary spectacle of bark or branch, wounded with the nail, naming it tree, a thing, of liberty, that idea, a goddess or a snake, not the real property, an enslaved woman, not a tree's unseen relation of light and water, only loyalists mocking it, consecrated as an idol for the mob to worship, while Sons of Liberty thing do it up. A voice wonders, does a tree have a right to rehearse on beer-soaked grass, finding more than common fruit in the branches? Resistance. Men surround a tree, debate the problem. Some want immediate action, others more discussion. Lives are at stake here, they shout at each other, because happiness is not as it should be. Gangs of men are sent, sometimes armed soldiers, to identify a tree, a body, a border, an idea, to surround and celebrate or destroy property, depending on its position and what might be found there, how fast the contagion is spreading. A tree surrounded as a natural thing is imagined. An idea shows what it's not on neighboring land, where a thing can be thought and a thing can be cut down. These are different responsibilities. Like a pole is a tree for some purposes, as an is an ought. As around the pole they drunken dance and people hear of it, the idea moves. A young sapling may change history or leave it to die, cured by a dose which might otherwise be fatal. A tree surrounded by men in their natural cover, speaking but interrupting. Make this easier. Here's a voice, a vector between neighbors. Canopy, insects, roots, sapwood, later a coffin. A tree, a voice going round till it comes round. From the crowd, a government. A tree to cross an ocean. The story, once sure of itself, becomes a situation. Resistance. Across the ocean. A tree to cross an ocean. People whisper, revolution, they lost their heads. Was Tom Paine the vector? Or Lafayette, who stood on the stump at Essex and Washington for a good half hour? Henri Gregoire. The tree destined to become the emblem of liberty must be chosen from those with long lives. And if it cannot be everlasting, at least it should be chosen from among those trees whose life lasts several centuries. Jacques Aubin, looking back over their shoulders, moved the tree idea to Vienne, France, 1790, destined for blood and revolution. A voice sneers, why does a tree need a hat? A rallying cry, composed of costumes at odds, a drunken mob. After Louis XVI tells Saint-Michel et Saint-Antoine they may not display their freedom arbre, inciting a march on the Tuileries until midnight and the king is forced to wear a liberty hat himself, resurrecting the maypole of the countryside, pruned to its uppermost, and painted in yearly charivari, fixed with razors and inkwells, and planted before a manor house. The first of many raids on rich families, a humiliating demand, furniture and wine, the terror of neighbors, until all maypoles are hacked into menacing silence, stalking, advancing, alive. Amsterdam, 1795, Rome, 1798, then Ireland, until not a son is born who doesn't have roots to defend. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great way to start this all. And Forrest, looking forward to your continuing.
All right. In a way, it is a kind of continuing from Thalia's work. So this is from, I'll read 3 poems from Twice Alive. Aubade. Can you hear dawn edging close? Hear soft light with its vacuum fingertips gripping the bedroom wall? An understated what? Exhilaration? Can you hear the voices, if they can be called voices, of toadies scratching in the garden? And then the creaky, low, husky voice flecked with sleep beside you in bed, telling a dream slowly as though in real time. And now interrupting that dream, can you make out the voice, if it can be called a voice of absence, speaking intimately to you directly, using the names of those who were vulnerable, those who are gone? I know you must hear it feelingly, a low vibration in your bones, for don't you find yourself absorbed in a next moment beyond your given life? And this is part of the long sequence, the title sequence, Twice Alive. Mycobiont, just beginning to enwrap photobiont, each to become something else, its own life and a contested mutuality, twice alive, algal cells swaddled in clusters. You take a 3-lens jeweler's loop to inspect the holdfast of the umbilicate lichen, then the rock tripe lichen, then the irenic amanita mushroom swarming with a kind of mite that has no anus, then the delicious chanterelles called trumpets of death. Supreme parsimony in drought lets lichen live on sporadic events of dew and fog, a velvety tomentum and the wet thallus. I crush oak moss between finger and thumb for its sweet perfume persistent on your skin when I touch your throat so slow to evaporate, the memory of seeing sunburst lichen on the sandstone cliff. Though crustose lichen relish decay, vagrant lichen go all hygroscopic, spores spurting out through walls split at the invagination fronts. But if herbivores eat wolf lichen, they die. And if carnivores eat it, they die writhing in pain. With the exception of mice, it is rarely possible to tell if lichen is dead or alive. In the presence of water, photobionts go turgid. In hours of dark respiration, a spermatic green corn smell takes the shape of a lamellated mushroom. In cavitating symplasts, spores loosen into the elongation zone on a night of caterwauling loons. So evening finds us at this wood's edge, where at a dead oak's base, shoestring rot glimmers, its luminescent rhizomes reflected from the eyes of a foraging raccoon that doesn't yet sense us. Air ghostly and damp clings as we step from our woods to look across the field toward the first lane of lit houses, their dull pewter auras restrained by wet haze. Cordyceps, the brown of your eyes, softened with rain and remotely fluorescent, dissolve into slime after a few days. Whatever we thought we were following was following us, its intention unlinked to our own. And then there's a sequence called Sangam Acoustics, from which this poem is part, called Immigrant Sea. Aroused by her inaccessibility, he aches for more of her life to live inside him, watching the breakers, standing so close he can feel heat coming off her wet scalp. What is his relation to this person before him, so familiar and foreign? The way he searches out her face, he searches out himself. Gusts thrash crests of swell, spring grasses twirl circles in the sand where they stand without speaking. She wants him to know it's all charged, even grass, positive, pollen, negative. So when grass waves, it sweeps the air for pollen. He feels electricity all around, as though the wild drama of the coming storm were already aware of them, foreigners on this shore. Little sapphire blue flowers speckle the dunes. He wonders if he has let himself flatten out into a depthless sheet like escalator stairs, whether in the end he'll disappear underground without the smallest lurch of resistance. But when her lavish face turns toward him, beaming, the corners of her eyes wind wet, he yields to that excess. He reappears to himself.
Thank you both so much. I think that gets us off to a great start. And we'll now turn to a conversational mode for about 40 minutes. And I'm going to start us off simply by asking Declan a question that's pretty general in nature, but is one that I've been thinking about a lot. And that's given the fact that you've been editing inventive literature for literally decades, almost 30 years, a little bit more, what have you seen change? And I'm thinking in terms of style or theme, attention, what's urgent now that didn't used to be, what used to be and isn't now, and to what do you attribute those changes? Politics, social? Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, to start off, I guess I should say that New Directions publishes both fiction and poetry, and about 30%, 35% of the books we publish are poetry, and the rest are fiction. And one of the ways that we've marked ourselves as a significant publisher these days is publishing a lot of foreign literature in translation. So I edit quite a bit of poetry, and I also edit fiction works in translation. And I guess over the last 20 or so years, a couple of authors that we've published have really had an impact on our publishing program, due largely to their success and due to their influence on writers who wrote after them. And I would say W.G. Sebald was one of those. When we first published his books, New Directions was in a sort of mode of publishing where we didn't really see ourselves as commercial. And New Directions started off in the 1930s with James Laughlin discovering experimental avant-garde authors. And Ezra Pound told him, any book worth publishing isn't really going to be recognized for 30 years. So that was always the philosophy of New Directions. We weren't a front list publisher. And the idea was to build this list of great literary works that were going to be taught in colleges and become essential literature for bookstores over time. So we never really thought significantly about publishing new works that were going to be commercially successful. And W.G. Sebald was one of these authors where, at least, in my term working there, all of a sudden he became a literary phenomenon. And we were selling copies of his books. They were all getting reviewed all over the place, and it was exciting. And I think also Sebald's writing had an impact not just on readers and reviewers, but on us. And when manuscripts came in and we sort of thought about publishing fictional works after that, there was definitely a little light that would go off when we read books that would be like, oh, this is like Sebald. And, there's always been our fictional works, the fiction that we publish tends to be very poetic, and there's also always sort of emergence of poetry and fiction genres in the fictional works, and Sebald really fit that, and a very close attention to things like memory, time, and so I would say that, in answer to your question, Cole, I've seen a change in not only how we view our publishing program, but the kinds of books we do influenced by previous writers. I think Roberto Bolaño also had a huge impact on our publishing program. We saw just this incredible success with the discovery and publication of those books. And after that, we thought, wow, we can really find great literary works that are experimental, that are doing something new, that can also be successful. And so I don't know if that answers your question. That's one aspect of what we're doing and how things have changed.
Thank you. I'm going to turn that same question over to Thalia and Forrest as well, and say, from the perspective of writers who've been writing for decades, what do you see changing in your surroundings or in the general field, and to what do you attribute it? Forrest, why don't you start off?
Okay, Forrest, please. No, go ahead, Forrest.
I was thinking also that Anne Carson is probably another New Directions writer that was published first by, that New Directions picked her up early in her career, and that her work also was massively influential and is an example of that sort of cross-genre field that New Directions has explored so much. And I mean, what I've noticed at New Directions is that the success of books like Sebald and Bolaño and Anne Carson has interested them more in and they were always great at finding incredible work and publishing it. But now there's more follow through at the publicity end. After the post publication, the books are getting around more because New Directions realizes that that helps with sales, which in the absence of a very wealthy editor, a very wealthy publisher editor like James Laughlin, is necessary for the press's continued future.
Remember, Forrest, that was a little frustrating for you when we first started publishing your books. We had one publicity director for every book we were doing, and it was just overwhelming for that person. And now that there's so much promotion and publicity of books through social media, we've discovered that you really need two, which some people would say isn't enough either. We publish about 35 books a year, and that's a lot of work for two publicists.
You did happen to get two pretty great publicists, though.
We did.
Yeah, publicist editors. Yeah.
Thalia, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I was such an enormous fan of the writers from New Directions backlist, or even contemporary at my time, Susan Howe, Rosemary Waldrop, you know, and of course the kind of fiction that was being published, even John Hawkes, you know, that there was always such an attention to language in particular, and a real energy of things that I completely agree with what Declan was saying, like just don't speak only to a particular moment, but that are timeless. And I feel like that has continued on even as people who write, you know, and also this kind of hybrid or interdisciplinary space that has continued, if anything, to open up even more with writers such as John Keane. You know, I mean, there's just so many people that New Directions continues to expand. And I believe that the influence is really heavy. In terms of the business side, I mean, I was so lucky. My first book with New Directions that I worked with, you know, was in 2000. And I don't even think it existed in a digital, I think we did it in the old fashioned way. And what's been so amazing, and I believe there was really a moment of real scariness when bookstores stopped really stocking the backlist, and the online marketplace really took over, and the purchasing trends for how students buy books, coupled with the way that literature is now taught in English departments, which is often less about literature and often more about theory and cultural theory and stuff like that. I feel like there was a real scary moment when publishers like New Directions had to kind of regroup and figure out how to live in this very, very changed world of the way that books exist. And so I don't know if Declan wants to talk to that, but I remember feeling like, wow, you used to walk into a bookstore and just see all the New Directions books, you know, everywhere. And bookstores have become so different. They're so corporate now. They're just so different. So I don't know. And I think right now we're maybe seeing a circle where there's a resurgence of more independent bookstores actually reemerging, and the way that online, but I'd be curious, Declan, if you want to talk to that at all. I don't know if I'm making any sense or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I should say, I remember when it was first assigned Thalia's book, and it's a book called Point and Line. And it was sort of earlier on, and Barbara Epler, our publisher, was actually the one who first read it and fell in love with it. And it went around, and, you know, all the editors are, besides editing books, are also keeping the company running. It's a small company, so it's pretty crazy. And at the time, Barbara was just overwhelmed, and she said, "Would you mind working on Point and Line?" And I was, of course, excited. I'm so happy that happened, because I've been able to work on Thalia's books and get to know her, and I just love her work so much. But I guess, in answer to your question about about Amazon and books being sold over the internet, that was a cause of concern for us, and it has turned out to be a sort of blessing during the pandemic. Unfortunate for the independent bookstores, and it's just been really difficult for them when the pandemic first broke out last March, I was unsure whether we'd make it. It didn't seem like we were in a position to continue to be able to sell books with bookstores closed. But interestingly, Amazon just took over the market and people were buying books, and the publishing industry all over has seen this incredible surge of sales and had had 2 very successful years the last couple of years. What's hard is how it is for the independent bookstores. And I remember last year when the pandemic first hit, our books are distributed by Norton, and we were trying to come up with all sorts of ways we could delay billing and figure out ways to help the independent bookstores so that they could keep copies of their books in stock and not have to go out of business. But Amazon is a huge saver for us, and we just sell an enormous number of copies through them. So
I was thinking that one of the ways that New Directions has always been ahead of the ball of the publishing industry is, well, as you said, sort of in picking the kinds of books that whose importance might whelm 30 years later, but also at a point when there were so few books published in translation, literary works in translation in the US, less than 3%, just shameful disinterest in what's happening in the rest of the world. New Directions was really at the forefront of publishing books in translation and has continued to be.
Yeah.
And you've worked on a lot of those.
I have. And James Laughlin was always interested in that. He got a job working for the Ford Foundation, and in the early days, he really was traveling all over the world trying to find writers. And some of the early books that New Directions published were French Surrealist writing. He was really interested in Latin American writing, and he discovered Borges here. He was the first to publish Lorca. Writers like Yukio Mishima and Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha was one of the first bestsellers for New Directions. Henry Miller was begging Laughlin to publish Siddhartha, and he said, that's just a bunch of, it's lightweight Buddhism. But he was convinced, and that really carried New Directions for a while. So we've always been focused on that. And I remember during that terrible period in the early thousands when 9/11 happened, and we had a president that was pretty, in my view, parochial minded. And it was such a important thing for so many people for New Directions to be around, to be able to offer voices and writing of such interest and high caliber from different cultures and different countries. And I think it's right around that time is when other publishers got interested in publishing translations too. And you saw publishers like Archipelago grow up, and Open Letter and places like that that really started publishing solely translations. And we do that in poetry as well. And we publish Forrest translations we're about to publish a wonderful Mexican poet that Forrest translated by Corel Bracho. And we published her selected poems before. Forrest also brought some Japanese poets to our attention. And in poetry, it's really interesting and poses challenges publishing poetry in translation. We could talk a little bit about that. That would be interesting. But
another thing I think that's interesting that New Directions does is often in writers where you have a really multidimensional approach to the writer's life. I always appreciate that we often, even that somebody might be a fiction writer, but then we get an essay collection or an autobiography. I'm thinking of Muriel Spark. I mean, some of these amazing women that you published early on, it's not just one aspect of their work. I feel like you really encourage the reader to take an interest in the whole person in a very different way. I think that's something that's very interesting. I have a question, Declan, to kind of take in maybe a new direction. Is just what do you, you know, to many of us who don't have much editing experience or who don't work behind the scenes in publishing, you know, what would you say is some of the places that being an editor either are sort of have their most fruitful and sort of rewarding aspects of the process, and where is it sort of frustrating, or where for you maybe do you get entangled? Or I'd just be curious to hear you talk a little bit about the behind the scenes process for you.
Sure. I mean, I've always been a very musical person. You know, I play piano, and I always love the musical voice aspect of reading. So I think that's really helped me with editing. And I find that's often tied to the creative aspects. You know, part of my process is I usually, when I get a manuscript, I'll just read it for the first time, hardly marking anything. And then the second time is when I start making corrections. And it's really the third and fourth reading where it's almost like the words on the page disappear, and you're hearing the voice in your head. And that's really when a lot of the exciting things happen, because errors jump out at you, ideas of how this sentence or this line could read better. It's not pinpointed to any grammatical thing. A lot of times things just jump out at you when you're in that mode. And, you know, I'll find myself, I've said this a lot before, I find myself, my toes tapping as I'm reading, and I'm just sort of completely zoning out everything else. And that's a great, that's sort of a cool aspect to it. You know, a lot of times when you're reading, you read a book once, and that's great. But one of the joys of editing, and I'm sure that's true for you, Thalia and Forrest, because you're teachers, is you have to be so familiar with the text, every line, and see how it's working on all these different levels. So you get the opportunity to read multiple times and within a short period. So then all of a sudden, it's a totally different experience. And that's what I'd say one of my favorite things about the editing. And at the same time, you're working on a personal level with people who have put so much into their work. So, you know, I've had unfortunate experiences where I've over edited, and that's happened a couple of times, and that doesn't feel good because you feel like you've tried to smooth things out too much, or you haven't gotten it. But there are books you work on where you really feel like you've helped it. And so I guess there's the nuts and bolts work of, you know, handwriting all the changes, entering changes. A lot of production involves going through multiple stages of proof, and that can get pretty tedious. And in New Directions, the editor is really responsible for all aspects and every stage of the process. You don't hand it off necessarily to a copy editor. You have to do a lot of stuff that in other publishers, production people are doing. So some of that can get pretty long hours, tedious, but I love that too. You know, so.
I love you talking about your toe tapping while you're reading, Declan.
Do you ever do that? I heard you pounding on the table.
Yeah.
You're doing that?
They say that even when we read to ourselves quietly alone in a room, that our body is responsive to the reading, that our vocal cords actually move with what we're reading. And I know that during both of your editing of Thalia's last two books, we've been in correspondence, and you've sent me these sort of excited toe tapping, you know, I'm editing Thalia's books, it's so great, it's really good. I love that enthusiasm of yours. And Thalia mentioned the way that New Directions can focus on the fullness of a writer's work. And I think of Clarice Lispector as an example of that. New Directions coming out with new editions of the whole body of Clarice Lispector's work, which is so revelatory, it's so significant internationally. And The Passion According to GH is just one of the best books I've ever read in my life. Just flat out amazing.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was just going to say, Thalia was pointing out before that one of the unique things about New Directions, and this happens at other publishers too, we publish not just the major works by many of our authors, but the essays, the letters, William Carlos Williams, he wrote in so many different forms, and we publish 30 books by Williams. Tennessee Williams wrote plays, but he also wrote memoir and stories and novels and essays, and that's something that's always been important to New Directions. And a lot of our sort of fundamental pillar authors, we make a point of publishing their entire works, and the authors' estates really like that.
I'm seeing the manuscript marked up that Malvika just put up on the screen, and the way the handwriting and the typescript interact is just such a beautiful, dynamic display of how you make a book. Would you like to talk about how you made those marks and how what you expected from them and any aspect of it?
I hope you don't feel too exposed here.
Not at all, not at all.
This is one interesting thing that Thalia did in this work is that she played with compound nouns, some of which she made up, some she didn't. So you'll see those circled words. A lot of those don't necessarily need the hyphen or should be two words. So throughout the manuscript, I circled those, and I sort of got the idea that it was important to Thalia to have hyphens there. She was creating that served a function. And I sent all these changes to Thalia, and I think she incorporated quite a lot of them. But she also sort of used, I think, my changes as Thalia, maybe you could confirm this, my changes as an opportunity to revisit some parts of the book and do some rewriting. So, and this has happened, I actually love when this happens. This happened to me working on the early Jenny Erpenbeck novels with Susan Bernofsky. I would send changes and she would agree with a fair amount of them, but it was almost like the edits were a springboard to revisit the work and make further changes. And this happened a little bit with Thalia. If you go down here, I think she did make a lot of these corrections, but she introduced new things, which I think really improved the book a lot. And I don't think that necessarily had to do with my ideas. It was just her going through it again and seeing new things to change.
I wonder how you speak a little bit about your experience of like receiving the edits, that kind of like intimate.
Well, yes, I mean, obviously this is my fourth book with Declan, so I'm very used to the kind of edits that he gives, and often they're very intuitive, and he's often quite correct. Especially in the first page that he showed, a kind of like unnecessary verbiage there. I got rid of that, and he's very in tune to the rhythms of the prose as it goes along. And luckily, he likes my sense of humor, and so he tends to get that as well. So it's always a pleasure. And yeah, I think Declan's right. I mean, I try very, very hard when I turn in the production draft to try to get it as far as I possibly can, so I don't end up wasting anybody's time. But Declan's often he's very intuitive, and I will rework a section, mostly for me, for pacing, to make it better, to make it read better, to get rid of redundancies and places where I'm not quite clear. So he's very good at prompting those moments for me to reflect and to make it better before we finalize it.
Really underscores the notion of the editing process as a conversation.
Exactly.
Yeah. One of the first things I learned as an editor was propose changes as suggestions or improvements. And it's really up to the author to agree with them or disagree with them. And I've always, and that's true with translators too. The translators usually you treat like the author, but I always, it's one of the nice things about working with Thalia and Forrest for so long is that we've gotten into a rhythm of working on these books together. So when I send them corrections, I usually feel not nervous. It's always, or not so nervous, a little bit nervous. But with, when you're working with a new author, sometimes you send the changes and you're sort of on tenterhooks for a little while until they write back and say, you know, these are great, or these aren't so good, or, you know, you come, again, it's a conversation.
Declan, I want to jump in with one more question, which is, so in these conversations, we frequently have a lot of like young writers, young editors, and what feels like the most intuitive question to that audience might be, you know, how have you developed these editorial chops? What was the process that allowed you to develop this kind of fine-grained like editorial thinking?
Well, I didn't really get to edit at New Directions. I started off at the front desk answering the phones and helping everyone at the office do what they were doing. I was sort of an assistant to the whole office. And Barbara Epler, who's our publisher now, was the editor-in-chief pretty soon after I came on. And I didn't want to be annoying, but I made it very clear to her that I was interested in editing. And after a while, she gave me a manuscript to work on. And it was a book of stories by Viktor Pelevin, the Russian writer. And she had already worked on it, but she gave me an unedited version. So I edited the first story and showed her, and then got to compare them to her edits, and that was really helpful. So over time, I just, a lot with the help of Barbara, I just learned how to not over edit, because that's really crucial. And over time, you just sort of get a feel for what's necessary and what's not necessary. And oftentimes with these books, they involve things like notes and editorial apparatus and things like that. I worked on this crazy book with Forrest, a Japanese writer named Gozo, who, it was a crazy book because the poems were translated virtually untranslatable. So, and it was almost like an anthology of translations by different translators. So you had the translation on the right-hand side of the page and the translators commenting on their translations, explaining the process. And then in the end, there were, you know, additional elements, and it was really crazy. And so I guess, you know, there's not just the art of editing, but a lot of what goes into book editing is kind of traditional publishing, things like that you have to reckon with.
I wonder, as we move to the other, so shall we look at Forrest's manuscript pages? Now we can embarrass you next. And while we move over, I am curious, what does it mean for a collection of works to be comprised out of almost untranslatable content?
Forrest, you want to talk about that book again?
So New Directions is the only press in the world that would have published this book. And although I've published a lot of translations and translated a lot, as Cole has, despite that this book probably had less of a readership than any of those, I consider it one of the most important things that I've done, either as a writer or a translator. Gozo Yoshimasu is one of those writers who, one of those figures who immediately became clear to me as, you know, as a rare a really rare, important, internationally influential writer. And I desperately wanted his work to be more available to a US audience, because the translations that had been available had sort of flattened out his work to its semantic level. And his work was much bigger than that. It was, there was plays with different kinds of, with the 3 different kinds of Japanese writing characterizations, hiragana, among, and French and all sorts of stuff. So the idea was to have that a writer whose work was so multifarious needed a translations approach that were equally multiple. And so, I asked a number of really hotshot younger translators mostly to translate this work. And it's amazing. It's a book that can't be read like other books. Somebody on in the chat had talked about cover design, which would be really interesting to talk about. And for me, these last 2 books, especially my last books, who were both designed by Rodrigo Corral, those designs were so congruous with the work of the book. It was as though if I had been a designer, it's exactly what I would have wanted to do. I've been really amazed at the correspondence between Corral's covers and the work inside them.
Yeah. I mean, one of the reasons we've really been doing much better the last few years is the cover designs. And Eric Rieselbach is our production editor, and he has done an incredible job reaching out to all the top New York book designers who have this reverence for New Directions and are willing to do freelance work for us at the New Directions fees. So it's really been great, and the bookstores love it, and it really makes the authors feel better, witness Forrest, and it's just been great for New Directions. We've got sort of a new look, I would say. I remember when I first came to New Directions, it was the editor's job to find the cover art to provide to the designer. So I would go up to a lot of times, like when I was working on the Guy Davenport books early on, he would send me photographs and artwork that he wanted us to incorporate. Nowadays, that's not so true, but I would, and we hire designers and give them license. But I remember in the early days, I would go up to the New York Public Library, the main branch on 42nd Street, not the New York Public Library with the lions on it, but the one a couple blocks down. And they had a giant image file system, and you could just look through it and take out images. And I remember working on an HD book, her translation of some ancient Greek plays, and in those old files, I found some old pictures of Greek pillars, and I just took them back to the office, sent them to the designer, and she came up with a design. But nowadays, we have these designers who are true artists who are coming up with these just brilliant designs. So.
Shall we take a glance at the marked up manuscript of Forrest? Because it struck me when I was looking at them earlier today that there's some differences. That's a different approach that you took as an editor, because the texts are different. And I wondered if you wanted to talk about the differences.
Sure. I mean, Forrest, Forrest is writing more in the genre of poetry, and I ended up not, as you can see, a lot of the changes are really typographical things that I'm bringing to his attention. So I think with Thalia, I was making more edits because her work is written in sort of a cross-genre form. And so I could make little syntactical suggestions. And with Forrest's work, he's given so much careful thought and energy to each line, since it's such tight poetry. So you can just see here, there's mostly typographical things. And I think.
Well, you say that, but you're being modest, Declan. You really, like Thalia and Cole and lots of people listening, I've done lots of editing, and I'm always absolutely shocked by the things that I miss, including word choice that you've been really spot on with in editing all of my books, sort of where my word isn't quite right, and you ask me to rethink it. So it's more than just typography that you do.
This one I remember, I was about to send you all these corrections, and then it was late at night, and I thought, I should just read it through one more time just to make sure. And that question about the diluvial there, all of a sudden that jumped out at me. I hadn't caught that except at the last minute. And we made that change, right, Forrest?
That's right. Thank you. Yeah.
We kept those two betweens belonged there, which you pointed out to me.
Yeah.
And on the next page, I can't read that there, but we made that at a lowercase and hellbox is one word. I think we kept whimpers with just as it was.
One of New Directions writers who's been most important to me is George Oppen, who says, clarity, clarity, surely clarity is the most important thing in the world. And that's what you bring to your editing, Declan.
Well, I mean, it's funny that you mentioned Oppen, because James Laughlin he had these relationships with these writers where they were like family to him. And the families trusted him, and he helped them so much. And George Oppen was one of those. Linda Oppen, his daughter and I email a lot, and we're sort of taking over agenting for the family. And for a lot of our authors, like Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, H.D., Lorca for a while, Mishima for a while, we not only published their works, but we helped with their rights, and we advised them on various issues that weren't always related to our own books, just to their works. We've helped give scholars access to their archives and libraries, and it's not just the books; it's the authors and their lives and their works and their rights. It's a very organic situation.
Declan, I have a question for you that sort of responds to some of the things that have been brought up and might interest a lot of people who are interested in both editing and translation, because you've been working, I hear, recently on a new translation of a book by Laszlo Krasznahorkai. Well, that surprised me because I thought he'd made all these announcements that with his last book, he was through writing fiction. So I'm interested in that. But also because you've been editing his books with two different translators, the two main English translators for his work, Ottilie Mulzet and George Surtzes. So I'm wondering, is voice an issue? Is a writer's voice an issue when there's more than one translator of a writer's work? And what are some of the examples of the kinds of edits you would make to Krasznahorkai translations? Also, those of you who haven't read Laszlo Krasznahorkai, I think he's another one of the most important, and lots of other people do too, writers of our time.
Yeah, if you haven't read Laszlo's work, it's just incredible. And it's, I won't go into a big description of it, but he's really one of our most important writers these days. The last novel that I worked on, Baron Wenkheim's Homecoming, won the National Book Award in translation. That's been a great thing for New Directions. The National Book Award, which is sort of like the Oscars of publishing. And you go to this big fancy ceremony at Cipriani's and everyone's in black tie. And Laszlo flew out and Baron Wencon was in, they don't announce it beforehand. They list the short winners and then, they announce the winner and then everyone goes up and accepts the award and that won the award and that was great. But I really, if you haven't read Laszlo's work, it's really amazing. And the early books were translated by George Surtees, who lives in England, and he's a brilliant translator and also an amazing poet. And he has now stopped publishing Laszlo just because he wants to put his energies towards other things. And I don't know how Adelie ended up becoming the translator, but she was able again to translate what is, Laszlo writes in these long extended sentences that are, there's no sentences in his book, hardly any. They're sort of ongoing, a whole chapter will be a sentence. And you hear stops that are marked by commas and semicolons and dashes. And Adelie was able to capture those into English also. So, both those translators were amazing, and I wouldn't say there was a huge difference in editing either of them. They were both really accomplished translators. There's also another translator named John Botke who's translated some of Laszlo's shorter works.
Can I follow up with a question, Declan? How do you initiate a translation project? I'm just, again, from a little bit of outside of the business, like, do you, as an editor, initiate pairings and putting things together? How does that work?
It usually just sort of falls into your lap. Most of us might be comfortable in a language or two, but you don't really, most of the times you get a sample translation when a work's sent to you. And we're lucky to have this whole group of translators writing in different languages who are really top notch. And so they submit their translations and recommend things to us. So it's rare that you're really out there looking for a translator. And when we do, we usually know who to seek out. I just finished working on a book by an amazing Chilean writer named Juan Emar, and the translator is Megan McDowell, but we had her translation already. And usually it's not too hard to find a translator. Sometimes it can be challenging if your go-to translators are already busy with other projects. You have to really seek people out sometimes.
I think we are winding down, so this is the moment, Thalia and Forrest, for any last questions, or Declan, for any questions that you may have or comments that you may want to make.
Well, let's see. I do have a question for Forrest and Thalia. Maybe you can answer this for me. You have worked with other publishers. Some of your books have been published by other presses. And I wonder if you could pick a book and describe briefly how it's different being published by one of those other publishers.
For me, that's easy. That the university presses that I've worked with, like Princeton or Wesleyan or University of California, have all been really terrific experiences also. But your close readings of the work have been the most intuitively connected to my intentions as a writer. And that's not some kind of compliment. It's really purely objective. If we looked at the things that you're marking versus just sort of presentational aspect of the other editors that I've worked with, who I've really liked also. Yours are more intuitively grounded in my work, probably because you know my work over these 25 years better than anyone else does.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a variety of experiences. It's funny, it's almost as though the different beasts live in different landscapes. All of the 4 New Directions books really form a series, and they really talk into each other and through each other. And so there's a coherence sort of to the whole experience that I've had. It was funny that you mentioned the cover, because as you know, I did all my first 3 books, I had a lot to do with the covers. And then this last one, which is a brilliant cover, but at first I was very resistant to having a professional designer. And we ended up with a weird compromise in the book, which is that this is the cover, and then the actual bird, I insisted that the actual picture of the bird was here, right in the frontispiece. And so it's almost it was a funny creative compromise, but the book, I actually have ended up really appreciating the professionalism of the cover. But I've been very lucky to work with small presses like Donkey, even though I think my collaboration with Abigail, so 2 collaborations with a French writer, Abigail Lang, and one was with Essay Press and the other was with Donkey Archive. And no one has ever, I agree with Forrest, I'm never given an editorial relationship that's quite as rich as the one that you and I have developed, because we have just now worked together on the certain particular, sort of species that we work with. Although experimental animals,
I like species. I like that.
It's like we're in a particular experimental animals. I had an incredible experience with solid objects, and I think that they have received a lot of mentorship from New Directions, and they were just brilliant, generous, amazing to work with as well. So I have to say it's been I've had the pleasure of working with the small presses, and I'm just such a true believer in the benefits of the small press universe for authors, where you're not sort of overcome by marketing departments and other kind of concerns that for writers who care about the longevity of work, I don't think are as relevant. So, but New Directions remains this gold standard. Although again, I want to give a shout out to Solid Objects for being as incredibly professional as they were, and wonderful to work with.
I'm working right now with an editor at Agni named William Pierce, Bill Pierce. He's an amazing editor also, just amazing close reading. But as we're sort of closing out our part, Declan, I have a question back for you, because I've heard that you're working now on a book with John Keane, one of New Directions' terrific authors, and someone whose work is important to me, both poetry and prose, on a selected poems by a guy named Essex Hemphill, who was a gay Black poet and activist, just my age, also lived in Washington, D.C. at the same time when I did, where he was involved with performance poetry, film, and gender and sexuality issues. I think a lot of people haven't heard of him. Do you want to say anything about that book?
I can a little bit. The ideas are brought to our attention by Brittany Dennison, who's one of our publicity directors. She has been aware of his work for a long time, and I have too, a bit. And it was kind of great because I read him back in the 80s when I was, when he was alive, and I was interested in his work. But then Brittany brought to our attention that he basically fallen out of people's radar. And so going back and rereading the poems made me see that, wow, this is not only, one of the things that New Directions really tries to do is with political poetry, which I would describe much of his work as, that it also needs to really be its own thing. And I'd forgotten how interesting a poet he is. And Jeffrey Yang, who edits a lot of our poetry, read the manuscript, and he agreed that it's really pretty remarkable work. And so we are now putting together a selected poems edited by John and a Harvard professor named Robert. And we just had an incredible Zoom meeting with Essex's family a few weeks ago, and they're so delighted that his work is coming back, and they clearly loved him, and this is such a big deal for them that his work is coming back. So I think this is going to be an exciting project. So, yeah.
That actually leads to maybe what might be a final question that I have, which is, if you're an editor who really believes in something, how much of an impact can you have? Like, where are the limits to the impact in the world that you feel? I mean, are there limits? What are the limits to having impact as an editor? Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were talking about this a little bit before, and if I really sometimes I feel like if I really wanted to change the world, I would be in a different field, and I have a lot of friends and family who are in social work and community organizing, and I live in one of the poorest big cities in the country, and you drive through these areas of North Philadelphia where the poverty is just so intense, and you think, what am I doing working for an experimental publisher? But I see reading and books as something that is pointing people in the right direction. And I've always loved being in nature and being in the outdoors. And I think especially during these times with climate change and everything, being connected to the natural world is so important, so crucial. And it's always given me centeredness as I was reading. So I think in making these books available, in making people read differently, see things differently, think differently, that's making a change, and that's important. And that's always been an important thing that New Directions has provided to generations of readers. It's an incredible opportunity and privilege to work there. It's like working for Museum of Modern Art or something. It's an incredible establishment, and we are still doing it, which is great.
Well, thank you all so much. I know we're coming around to the end of our program, so I think this is a beautiful place to open to Q&A. And we've gotten a number of questions coming in at the close of the hour, so hopefully we'll be able to hit them all. For our first question, we'll go to our very own Micah Gales Green. Micah, take it away.
Hi, thank you again for having this conversation with us. It's been so informative, and it's cool to listen to. And I was really fascinated by the kind of mention of the creative conversation between the editor and the writers. And that kind of made me interested in how would the creative conversation develop between the editor and the writer if the writer has passed away, such as you mentioned with Essex or Clarice Lispector. What is that creative conversation between the editor and the kind of writer's estate? And how does it make it more complicated?
The story that leaps out to mind is, the poet H.D. We published a lot of her works, and there's a novel that she wrote called Pilot's Wife that was, H.D. wrote a lot of novels, many of which hadn't been published. They've been starting to become more available. But she wrote in this sort of draft. A lot of these novels are sort of in early draft form. And her executor, Norman Holmes Pearson, used to edit her. And so this novel, Pilot's Wife, came in, which was sort of her rendering of, Pilate and the Jesus story. And it was in this draft form, and I thought it'd be great to publish it, and everyone else did at New Directions, but it really needed editing. So what do you do with a writer like HD? Do you edit her work? And So I wrote a lot of the HD scholars, people like Susan Friedman, and asked them, I said, what do you think? Is it okay to edit HD? And they all said it would be okay. And so I was very careful about it. I really didn't want to take liberties. So I remember at the time taking 10 pages of this HD novel and marking some corrections and sending it to 2 or 3, 4 HD scholars to see what they thought. And they thought I was on track. So then I went back and edited the rest. And I remember sitting in my apartment in Brooklyn and sort of having to imagine HD, this dead author. I definitely felt her presence sort of hanging over me while I was working on this. Maybe she was hating what I was doing, but and it really was just fixing errors and things like that. I wasn't trying to make it read better or chopping it up at all. I was just really trying to fix places that were wrong. You know? And that's usually what I try and do when I'm editing. We're lucky because most of the writers that we publish and the translators that translate their work are such incredible writers. Really what you're trying to do is fix things more than improve things. You know? So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
It certainly answered mine. So for our next question, we'll hear from our very favorite Lynn Crawford, who always has a fantastic background. She moves around different parts of her house. So we'll see where she is today.
Oh, hi, my study. Thank you so much for this talk. And Declan, I'm deeply moved by your passion for and knowledge of editing. And I sometimes find myself reading a really good book by a major press, and it feels like maybe sapped of something because it's maybe over edited. And I'm just curious how, if you ever see that happening where things are sometimes drained of an essence or an imperfection that someone like you who's so careful to spend time with a book and the voice works hard not to remove.
You know, I don't know a whole lot about what other publishers do. I've always been, you know, really admired editors at larger publishers who are actually, you know, I was reading Robert Gottlieb's book, The Avid Reader. I don't know if any of you've ever read that, but, you know, he's working with presidents and writers who actually you need to sit down with them and you're basically helping them rewrite the book. And I really haven't done much of that, you know. I have had a couple of instances. I actually just worked on a book of essays by Jenny Erpenbeck, the German writer. And I'd edited a few of her novels, and the essays came in, and I tried to edit it almost like it was like a New Yorker essay, you know, the essays. And the translator really, I'm grateful to Kurt Beals, who really said, look, you know, you need to step back and you're trying to smooth this out too much. And similar thing happened to me with Gustav Herling's stories. And the translator helpfully said, you're trying to smooth this out. This writer is writing in a very eccentric way, and you're missing that. And both those have been huge learning experiences for me. And I'm sure you're probably right if you're having that feeling when you read a book of fiction. Maybe that happens with larger publishers, that the editor tries and smooths it out too much. But we're lucky because usually the editor is corrected, or it just doesn't. It ends up not happening with us, I don't think.
Thank you. Thank you.
I find that so interesting because, and thank you for that answer. I forget who translates Clarice Lispector for you. It might be Benjamin Moser, or perhaps you have different translators working. But I remember when I was in college, I was reading a lot of Clarice Lispector from your press, and one of the translators had done an introduction and phrased it so beautifully. It was like, the the key to translation is not to prune the spines from the cactus, but to leave all the spines intact, which is, I think, like so relevant for Clarice's Spectre, but probably for like a lot of your catalog. And it just came to mind suddenly now. But thank you so much for that answer. I think for our next question, we'll go to G.E. Schwartz. And G.E., you should be able to turn on your mic now.
Thank you. Thank you. This has been such a great transport today from so many people. Maybe my question is more philosophical, but I'm thinking of books by Raphael Bernal and of course Krasnojarski, or Yegi, and is all imaginative writing speculative in the sense that it must imagine what it takes to be real, but fundamentally inaccessible, the sort of Ding Angst of one's own consciousness of the future or of social life, so speculative?
It's a tough question. I'm sure that all these writers are writing with that in mind. You know, there's always kind of reaching aspect to, and that's one of the things that a lot of my favorite writers, they're reaching in all of those areas that you described. So I think that's one of the things that makes literature most interesting, and there's that sort of reaching and longing aspect that that you see in Forrest and Thalia's work. It's one of the things that makes it most interesting.
Thank you.
Something just briefly, Malavika, that you said about the introductions to New Directions titles, and particularly translations. I think that's something also that New Directions has developed in like the last 15 years, that they've developed a whole new art of the introduction to the book. And one of the most articulate proponents of this kind of new genre of writing is Richard Seaberth, who's done a number of really fantastic introductions, just artful introductions.
I love that so much. I'm going to be a little bit greedy and take the last question for my own. I hope that's all right. But it's perhaps a combination of a number of themes that we were talking about in the pre-check. It doesn't take much to notice that Forrest and Thalia's books, among, I'm assuming, many more that New Directions have put out, both talk about political crises, whether ecological, environmental, which, you know, those are political crises, even if quieter, you know, deal with these themes. And you mentioned, you know, talking about Amazon in the year that we've just undergone in the pandemic, you know, we're really coming around to a year where the reading list, the pedagogy, the instructional was like a very DIY form, right? There was at least a good 6 months where reading lists around race, white supremacy, abolitionist reading, critical race theory, things like that were the dominant mode of how I would say like the majority of left-leaning or liberal-leaning people in the country engage with one another. Another thing that I think has come up during this conversation is a way that there's a parallel in 2020 between, I think, the way that we were sending money and donating money to mutual aid or bail funds or GoFundMes, these kinds of like direct political action really got mobilized and uplifted. And I feel like at the same moment, I at least saw a huge surge in, you know, people sending money also to the cultural and arts and literary organizations, the venues that they most wanted to preserve, right? So I was seeing, I'm from, like Thalia, the south side of Chicago in Hyde Park, and I noticed the bookstore in our neighborhood there's maybe 6 or 7 bookstores, but the main one was closed down. And what happened is when they reopened just online, they had, you know, they were booked solid for 4 months. Like they couldn't deal with the orders quickly enough because everyone was filled with a kind of urgency of, you know, what happens if the shape of our community falls flat, right? What happens? Like, I think there's this way we all the stepping up, or stepping 2 degrees closer to actually investing directly into the arts and cultural political landscape we want to live with and live in. And then more recently, I'm thinking, and I don't really have answers for that, but I'm thinking about the Palestinian occupation and displacement, like the direct call on those in American arts and letters to like step up and make statements. And then I've been noticing, because it's a pet interest of mine, both the hesitancy of cultural organizations to do what is asked, and then those cultural organizations that come forward and completely redesign the way they do programming or the way they do publishing, things like that. This is a long question, but even your comments about driving around in like northern Pennsylvania, looking at poverty and then wondering about the flip side, like what are you doing at New Directions? I guess my question is like, how do you, and actually this is a question for everyone, but how do you, the 3 of you, the 4 of you, how do you think about the role or the capacity of book publishers, that kind of industry, in addressing these huge political issues? And then there's a speculative question here also, perhaps, which is, maybe we can't say what it is right now, but is there a shift that's happening? What do you speculatively see that it could be in the future, in terms of like community building? How do we use a press to create these alternative social models that we want to live in? And where is that happening? What are the dreams?
Do you want me to answer that, or try to?
If you can, if you have any thoughts, it's sort of unanswerable.
I tried to answer it before, and again, I think that with all these huge problems, there are people who are working actively against these problems in different fields. But I do think that New Directions is pointing people in the right direction, and there's this, there's so many problems right now, and I think a huge problem is technology, and New Directions is not in the is offering a counter to that. And when you talk about community, there's this incredible community around New Directions, the independent booksellers, the reviewers, the people that love this kind of literature, the writers, the staff, and it's sort of like a small family. And then there are these sort of orbits around it with all these amazing people who care about literature and care about the world. And I think the community that surrounds New Directions is counter to a lot of the ways that the world is moving that are problematic.
Just a quick thought is that every book is in itself a community, and it gathers a community and creates community all around it. And I was thinking about all the values inherent in the literature that New Directions publishes, thinking about Sebald or Clarice Lispector and the insistent values that those books put forward and the real work that they do in the world.
Yeah, and I think about the politics that have been invested in New Directions books from the beginning, that writers like Kenneth Patchen or Robert Kaufman, Bob Kaufman out in San Francisco, or that incredible book Malvika brought up, Palestine, that Peter Cole translated by Aaron Shabtai, which is sort of the Israeli, a critique from within Israel of Israel political policy, which was also just a fantastic book of poems.
There's a long history of New Directions authors that were politically engaged and wrote from that perspective. Denise Levertov's poems were focused on, were anti-war and very political. There's, Ernesto Cardinal.
Elliot Weinberger,
his essays, there's a long line of these writers.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Thank you. I love what GE has put in the chat. Yes, publishing a serious piece of literature is an act of resistance.
Yeah, thank you, GE.
The right sentiment to close us out. But I will say, so it's our tradition at the Rail to end with a reading, oftentimes poetry, sometimes prose. And before, we move to Declan, who will read to close us out in style, I have to ask one final question of the hour, which is, personally, outside of your role as an editor, as a writer, as a reader, as a human, how does editing New Directions kind of intersect or support your own writing practice? I have to anticipate that having such serious editorial chops informs and bleeds into your writing, but I also wonder about how the role of the community exposes you to new texts that perhaps you engage with. But I'm wondering what is that sort of cross-pollination?
I mean, I've never really been interested in becoming a writer, and it's
okay.
something that I've really, I took some writing classes for a few years early on, just because I was interested in editing and thought that it was important that I try and write to know what it's like on the other side. As far as reading goes, I'm always, I always like to have a book that I'm reading outside of New Directions that's not, work. There's always lots of manuscripts to read and projects to edit, but there's nothing like getting to bed at night and reading a novel that just for your own enjoyment. And I think that's important. It helps you with your work because you see what else is out there and what other writers are doing.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, so without further ado, handing you the mic, what will you be reading for us today?
Well, I'm just going to quickly read. I know everyone's getting tired. This has been kind of a long event, but I've really enjoyed it. I'm so grateful to everyone for coming and listening, and to Forrest and Thalia. It's really been wonderful. But I'm just going to read a very short poem by a Greek poet whose book we're about to publish, named Phoebe Giannisi. She's one of Greece's foremost contemporary poets, and she writes sort of like Inger Christensen. And she's very consumed with memory and time and the natural world. And this is a poem of hers called Preparation. Only then was I living in the absolute present, while also preparing the present, which belongs to preparation. I mean to the building of each brick that is added one by one, absolute now, before it stops, as the sound of children's feet racing, and the briskness of the doors opening and closing. The absolute present for us is the preparation for them of desire. And crickets have camped out under the roof of the schoolhouse, perched in front of the microphone to magnify their voices and serenade us from their nook. It's gone, it's gone, it's gone. What you were waiting for passed without your noticing. It was already raining, raining, raining. That's it.
Well, thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Declan. Thank you, Malika.
Yeah,
Thank you,
thank you
Declan.
all. Thank you all for joining
Thank you,
us.
Thalia.
Thanks
Yeah.
to
Cole.
the
Yeah, thank you, Cole, for bringing us all together and creating this space.
Thank you all for coming together and
yeah.
everybody for coming to listen.
Yeah,
And
this is fantastic.
And again, next month, we do it again with a different press, Ugly Duckling, Matvey Yakelevich, Monica Delatore, and Rachel Levitsky. So please come join us for that. And again, thank you, all of you. Just
Thank you.
Wonderful program, Cole. Thank you.
great. And happy move, Forrest. May it go
Thank
well.
you. Thank you. Till it's over.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much. I know we've been in the Zoom for a little while and everyone must be hungry for lunch, but I'll invite you to turn on your mics if you'd like to say hello to each other, goodbye on your way out, or anything else. But this has been truly, really special. Thanks so much.
Thank you
Have
so
a
much.
beautiful rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
Thank you, Malvika.
Thank you.
Distinguished
Thanks,
guest,
Really inspiring.
it was an honor to be on the same debate with you, with a Pulitzer Prize winner and this famous editor. Thank you, thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. I read a lot of your books.
I look forward to the autumn releases.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank
Well,
you.
shall we
Beautiful.
Shall we break for lunch? Okay. Well, love and courage, everyone.